On this episode of the Roots and Reflections podcast, I sit down with NHLA's Chief Inspector, Dana Spessert. As a third-generation lumberman who grew up around his family's sawmill in West Virginia, Dana got his first taste of the lumber business at age 3 and never looked back. Our conversation digs into Dana's childhood and early career, the countless experiences and lessons that led him to his current role, the many hats he wears with NHLA, and the advice he would give to the next generation of young men and women in the industry. Now sit back and enjoy my conversation with Dana Spessert. Hey Dana, thanks for joining me on the show today. It's an honor and a privilege to have you here. You're definitely a very well-respected member of the industry, and I'm very excited to chat with you today.
Good morning, Ben. I really appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate the kind words.
So let's jump right in. I know you are I believe you said third-generation lumberman. So tell me about your childhood, your early days growing up in the family business, and what that was like.
Yeah, so starting out, I tell a lot of people that I've been in this industry for 54 years now because I'm turning 57. And a lot of people's like, there's no way. Well, when you grow up in the industry, you kind of don't have much choice. I would help my dad to add up tallies and things like that at a very early age. At 4 years old, it was just common because I had older siblings that taught me how to do addition and how to read and things like that. So I really had a good jump start there. But growing up in this industry was, at times I thought, wow, there's got to be something easier out there because, you get out in the heat and the dirt and, I don't know when the first time I actually saw pavement or concrete. I don't even know how old I was at that point in the sawmill yard type thing. But yeah, starting out in it just because it seemed normal. It's like I just knew hard work from an early age. And my dad had a policy. He would write a list of things for me and my siblings to do every day. And if we got it all done, then it was a longer list the next day. So, not only were we in the lumber industry, we were also in the farming industry. So if we wasn't working in the lumber, we were farming. So it was just, doing schoolwork was a side gig in our world. So somehow I managed to make it through. But it's been a long journey and it's been a very fruitful journey for me.
I'm glad to hear that. So it's interesting that you touched on schoolwork, and that kind of leads into my next question: is what are some of the lessons you learned really early on in life, growing up around your family business?
Well, one is a lot of patience because family strife is a real thing, and it carries into the dinner table, believe it or not. But one thing that my father taught me was always give a good measure. So no matter what it was, if we were filling sacks of grain or if we were tallying lumber, is always make sure you gave a little more than what you're charging for. Because he was always like, I want a happy customer. I want them to come back. I want them to know that we're honest and good people. So that was one of the early lessons. And again, with the patience, working with your family, it's very trying at times, but you also learn from that. And it's really helped me a lot with that. And as my mom used to say, there's 3 ways to do everything. There's the right way, the wrong way, and then there's your dad's way. So we're your dad's way.
I like that.
Yeah, he actually taught me so much. You couldn't learn from a book. It was, he taught me about the lumber industry, but also mechanical work. He was very skilled at all these type things. So, in my early days, we would buy old farm equipment, bring it in, sand it, paint it, and sell it. It looked like new, but we'd sell it as used. And that was a pretty lucrative business for him back then, believe it or not, in the middle of West Virginia. So people wouldn't think of that being farmland, but there's a lot of small family businesses.
Sure. So you mentioned kind of the feeling as a young kid of like, wow, there's got to be something easier out there. Did you know, obviously, spoiler alert, you've had a long career in the lumber industry. Did you always know that that was a career that you wanted to pursue? How did you get to the point? I know you went to the inspector training school in '86. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So how did you get to that point, and what, is that something that you always knew you wanted to do, or how did you kind of find yourself there?
Well, that's a great question. Growing up in the industry, seeing my father grade lumber and other people grade lumber, I knew that was a career choice. And the one thing I'll say about my father, he never pushed me to do one thing or the other except work. And he was always a firm believer, if you work hard, you'll get somewhere. So with that, I had the option because I always did fairly well in, primary school. And it came down to, do you want to go into school? Well, to college. And I just really didn't see myself going anywhere. In West Virginia, you basically had two options. You could be in the lumber industry or you could be in the coal mining industry. So I'm like, I don't really like going in holes in the ground. So I just kind of went that route. And to come to school down here, I actually thought myself as a truck driver because I was hauling lumber at 16 years old. The laws were different back then, so it was legal. But I ran into a gentleman at a lumber yard that we were unloading at or sold the lumber to, and it happened to be a national inspector. And he's the one that actually encouraged me to come here. Even though my father came through in 1962 and graded lumber, and I worked with him a lot, he never really, one way or the other, he said, yeah, it's a good option. But thankfully, he never forced me into it, so I didn't ever have any resentment there. But with the encouragement of his name was Richard Shears, believe it or not, several years later, he ended up working for me, so in the private industry. But before I came here, my father had me to go to what we call a short course today. It was a 5-day training. And he said, that's probably your best place to go, see what the rules are about. Even though he'd been doing it, he's like, go there and see if you think that would be a career choice. And I did and loved it. So that's how I ended up coming here eventually. And, I have a quick story. I was riding with one of my bosses a few years ago, and I told him, I said, Steve, I really wish I'd have went to college. And he looked at me and said, I wish I had your experience. So, it meant a lot to me. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Obviously you're very closely tied into the inspector training school, and we'll dive into that a little bit more later in this episode. But one thing that I've always heard is that there's a lot of camaraderie with your class. So what was your experience like going through the inspector training school? And, is that something you look back with, with fond memories on?
Oh, absolutely. So coming out of West Virginia, other than driving truck within West Virginia, I never drove outside the state because that was because I was 18 when I came down here. So I hadn't been really anywhere. Our family would go to like Myrtle Beach or Virginia Beach for vacations, but that was about it. And coming down here, the first experience I had was getting on the wrong direction on a 4-lane road in Lexington. Because to me, Lexington was a big city. And back then it was 55 miles an hour. That was the big thing from Ronald Reagan's term. And 55 saves lives. So it took me around 16 hours to get here.
Oh,
so
wow.
It was like driving to China at the time and just very, not ever seeing flatland like in this area. So that was a really big shocker to me that there was places like this. And then, of course, when you get to Memphis, it's like 5 lanes of traffic each direction. And, so it's very chaotic. But coming to the school, they made you really feel comfortable. They had, in my class, there was 39 students. And, of course, throughout that time, it was 14 weeks. So throughout that time, you did learn everybody's name. I've got a lot of stories about that I probably won't share, but it's, being 18, first time away from home and, living out, it was an experience that a lot of people should experience that. Whether they go to college or whatever, that experience is something you take with you to your grave. And it was a great experience. I run into a lot of these guys that I went to school with in the industry today. And, of course, we always start talking about the class and what we did in the evenings and things like that. So, yeah, it is a challenging class that we have, but it's also very rewarding. If you can get through it, then you feel like you've accomplished something. So, but yeah, I can tell you one quick one. It was the year I know Chicago Bears was in the Super Bowl that year. I don't remember who they were playing, but I'm not a gambler. But they started a pool, and it was like we just pulled numbers out. So it was the last number of the score, like 7-3 or something like that. And
Sure.
I pulled numbers out. I ended up winning $40, and I've never gambled before, and I still don't gamble. But it was like that was a great experience, and it was just pure luck. It was numbers that when I was doing in my head, I'm like, I'm never going to win, and I won in the first half and the second half.
Hey,
So
there you go.
Yeah, it was fun. And of course, we were hanging out with a bunch of guys and having a good time. So.
Awesome. So, as you finished up your inspector training school, what was your first step out into the industry after that?
Well, because we had built a sawmill when I was in high school. We had, previous to that, when I was 13, my dad leased the first mill that we had. So that was pretty much summer work and in the evenings. But then we built a sawmill while I was still in high school. I took half day senior because they would let you do that. And so I basically did all the welding because I took a welding class in high school. And so I welded all the metal stuff up. But it was a wooden structured mill with some steel parts. So we had that going when I actually went down here. So the purpose was that not only from our mill that I would grade the lumber, it was all the lumber within 25 miles of the radius of our mill. My dad was a lumber trader for years. Not only did he have the dry kilns, he would buy and sell lumber all over. So he would bring it in and I would combine it together, upgrade it, and make extra money off of that. So we were able to ship, at least a trailer load of green lumber every day, whether we sawed it or whether it come in from somebody else. So, and I just told the class over just a minute ago, when I got out of school, I get back home and my dad had put 6-quarter poplar, random grade and random length on sticks, and there's about 150,000 feet of it. Well, I didn't know that I would ever get through all that lumber, which in today's world, that's maybe a couple of days production. But for me, it was a month's worth of work. And I'll never forget when he came in a couple of weeks later and he said, "Son, if you can't go any faster than this, we're going to go broke." So it kind of made me go faster because that the fear is getting it wrong when you leave here. And then you have to learn that it's acceptable to be off a little bit. You just got to get lumber moving because it's a raw material and, there's a lot of variations in the way people see things.
Right. So you got to find that balance.
Yeah. It's a tough thing. It's the biggest transition that these students have to make when they leave here.
Yeah, I can imagine. So next, after doing some kind of the independent grading, your next stop was with Colonial Millworks, correct?
Well, yeah, because I did some freelance and then I would do a lot of contract work for different people. But then I actually went to Tiger Molding, they're no longer in business. It was a family-owned business, and I think third generation, they ended up shutting it down. So I worked for them for about a year, but it was the first time I'd ever been exposed to the end use of lumber. And, I always prided myself. I'd never had a complaint on lumber out there, a dispute that I lost. I mean, I had a few, but not very many. But then when I got on that end where we were consuming the lumber, now I was the guy complaining. So I was grading against the grader that shipped it. Because previous to that, I was always the first line grader. Now I'm the guy that's checking somebody else. And it actually started out, I was a little concerned that maybe I'm too hard on it or, different things. And all inspectors go through that, especially if you start seeing a lot of off grade, you start doubting yourself. Because previous to that, I never used a tape measure, and all of a sudden I'm measuring every board to get the right length because I didn't want to mess up. And I had several complaints and started creating a little animosity with the suppliers because they're like, "You're too hard on it." And yet, I'm on the receiving side, and it's like, but you're not shipping what you said you would. So,
right.
But then when I went to Colonial, I was at Tiger Boney for a year, and I went to Colonial, which is literally across the creek in Beverly, West Virginia. And it was a little bigger company. And they did all kiln dried, where it was green at the other mill, or the other molding manufacturer. So I go over there to Colonial and start grading. It was a lot easier because everything they bought was FAS. And 90% of it was 10 foot and shorter. So, I mean, volume-wise, we could go through a lot of lumber a little bit at a time. And there was things within the rules that we could accept. For instance, full-length wane was not an issue, but a third the width, if it went a 16th of an inch over, I rejected it or called it a one common if it made it. And, of course, that created a lot of problems out in the industry because they hadn't had a grader up to that point. So they weren't used to people saying, "Oh, you're off grade," So I had people come in and say, "If I throw that out, I'm shooting myself in the foot." I heard every excuse in the book about why they could ship it. But one of the things I did learn was like hard maple has these little, well, I always called them pin knots at the time. But after working there and seeing the customer base for Colonial, which Craft Made, Marilat, some of these really big names, they didn't have a problem with these things that I was defecting. So I learned that lesson that, hey, I could be a little easier on that. So I learned more about what the customer, the end user, was seeing. And I tell all the students and everybody I run into, I didn't learn how to grade lumber until I went to work where they consumed it. So I always recommend people, hey, get an opportunity to go on this side that uses the lumber. All the things that you look at and have questions about, you'll learn the answer on the other side. And I would say it works the other way. If you're always on the buying end, you need to go to the production side of it and see the seller's side of it and their point of view. Because that, until you get that full scope, you really don't understand.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like you had, in a relatively short period of time, a lot of really valuable learning experiences going from the family business into, working with somebody else.
Yeah. I mean, because if you look at it and thinking back on it, you take a sawmill that's taking a log and it gives you what it gives you. Whatever God put in that tree, that's what you're going to get out. Now, there's some things within it that you can improve the value. But your tendency is, on the sawmill side, is I don't know why they'd have a problem with that. But then you go on the consumer side and you're like, wow, they're only getting this much yield, and I'm saying they should be able to get this, and then you find out why. Miscut lumber, I mean, there's a lot of factors, stain, things like that on the green side you tend to want to push. But on the consumer side, they're like, I can't use it for any product. So that full range is, again, I just think everybody ought to experience both sides of that. And it gave me a unique experience and perspective on lumber grading.
Wow. Yeah, that's really insightful. So your next big step in your career was going to Coastal, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I went there in 2001, I believe it was, and they hired me as a QC technician. And yet they weren't prepared for that because previously at Coastal, they had one quality control person for the whole company. And when I went to work for them, they had 19 locations. Some of them were softwood, but then most of them are hardwood. And they had sold the softwood shortly after I started there. But they wanted to come in, and what they had done was hired, or as a vice president of the company, a softwood experienced guy. And he brought the quality control aspect in, and he said, this is not how you do things. So he wanted to create a quality control department. So they brought me in as a technician, and they hadn't hired a manager yet for that department. So the mill was 5 miles from my house, and I basically had a job with no duties. And it was a very interesting thing. It was like, we're going to hire you, but we don't have anything for you to do yet. And I was not allowed to fill in, inspect, or anything because they had they don't want you as a QC tech filling in for inspectors because they don't want you to side with inspectors, if you will, or feel sorry for their job kind of thing. Well, because we had to be very precise. And I'm not one to sit around much, and I just started making spreadsheets. It was something I learned from a friend at Colonial Millworks. I tell people all the time that, they have these different generations, like baby boomers. I say I was from the encyclopedia generation, where no internet. It wasn't even easy to call people from back then to find out. So you had to research. And when he showed me how to make a spreadsheet, I thought, well, now I see a use for a computer. Yeah, as a matter of fact, the first computer I ever saw was at a local college, and it filled up, I don't know, it had to be a couple 100 square foot room just to be able to type something. So, when I saw my first personal computer, I was like, that's going to be a waste too. But then when he showed me a spreadsheet, I started seeing the value, because we were able to set up different rip pockets for a gang and things like that. So when I went to Coastal, I had, it's a funny thing, is I put on the resume I had limited computer experience. Well, it took about 2 weeks to learn that I might have been their IT guy at that point. And they were a large company. They had 800 and some employees, and also they had their own IT department, but they would call me. I was going around and training people how to use spreadsheets and emails and all this stuff, which is kind of weird. But during that time, I was researching quality control, like lumber thicknesses and all these different things. And I went from using tape measures to measure the thickness of lumber to getting calipers out. And it scared the guys on the sawmill, because that was new to them. They all carried tape measures, but they didn't know what a caliper was. So that transition through that first year, I was having testing done. I was out testing lumber. I was regrading lumber and checking inspectors without anybody ever telling me to. So they wanted to hire somebody for the manager that was a college graduate and also had the NHLA certificate. And after, I don't know, it was 6-7 months, I'd talked to the vice president a couple of times, and finally one day he just said, "You're our QC manager." So I got promoted without even trying, just because I chose not to sit around like my counterparts. It was like 5 of the other guys. They wasn't doing anything. They were literally just enjoying the time off. But that's just not my style. I'm going to do something, right or wrong, unfortunately,
Right.
but I will get it done.
Did you sort of see that as a way to progress in your career, or was it just kind of your personality trait that, you didn't want to have idle hands?
It was, I didn't want to have idle hands. And I learned so much that first year about what my job was supposed to be. I knew what the previous guy did. I talked to him, and I had family members that worked at Coastal. So I knew what his role was. And I also thought, well, it's got to be better than this. And Coastal, they had gotten their managers together and decided what all they wanted to measure. So while I was creating stuff, they were talking about what they wanted to measure. Well, then they found out what I was measuring. They're like, well, that fits with what we've been talking about for a year. But no, it really wasn't, other than I wanted to do a good job. So don't get me wrong there. But it was mostly, I'm just not going to sit around here and wait for stuff to happen.
Sure.
And I would have just, threw it all away. But I mean, he was very impressed, and which was good, because he's a very respectable, great guy that I ran into since. And, he was a guy that walked softly, carried a big stick kind of guy. So, and he knew what the best way to do things.
So it sounds like whether you knew it or not at the time, you were really kind of training yourself for the job you would eventually have with NHLA. I mean, it sounds like a lot of the things that you were doing to research your position and fill time and keep yourself busy it sounds like you're just sort of teaching yourself what your job is now.
Right. That's true. And like I said, with my other experiences, the next big leap forward that I had was checking other inspectors. So on one hand, these are people that I had to talk to on a regular basis. They were at the mill sites, and I had to come up with a way, because the first thought I had, I don't want to tell another inspector that's worked hard as I have that he's wrong. And trust me when I say I made my share of mistakes when I started down this path. But it didn't take me long to realize if I go about it in a better manner, meaning I would go through the lumber when I first started and I'd say, here's what you got wrong. And I started realizing, how about I go through this lumber and show them what they got right? And that's when it changed for me, because then I was able to build confidence. And even to the level, I would go through a full pack of lumber. We did this for every inspector in our company every week. I mean, so there's a lot of inspectors. And so we did a lot of this. And I would just lay out boards that were what I just quickly grading thought, man, that's close. I would lay those out. And when I started, it would be a third a pack, sometimes a half a pack that were questionable. And then I'd bring the inspector out and they would prove me wrong. At least that's what they thought they were doing. But I wanted them to win on a lot of these boards. And after a while, I had a hard time finding those questionable boards. So after a couple of years, it took time, but because the only time I'd see them was for like 30 minutes at a time. They would come out, look at their lumber, but by letting them look at the lumber they graded, which I never had that opportunity previously, I thought that's the best thing you can do for an inspector because it built their confidence. And if you have a confident lumber inspector, he will be an accurate lumber inspector. So it was a revelation. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it sounds like, obviously you're building up, like you said earlier, like it's all about balance, right? You're building up balance of the technical skills and kind of that quality control aspect, but also the soft skills, the people skills of how to work with people and how to make it a non-confrontational interaction and how to, make it mutually beneficial.
Right. So one of the things that as the QC manager, I would have to go to the division meeting. So we would have a northern and a southern division meeting. And my base was in the north. So it was the majority of the companies we had, or the locations was in the north. And I would have to create their charts for their QC numbers, but also their production numbers. And the reason I ended up doing that part of it is because I was the only one in the company that knew what a pivot table was. So they thought I was spending hours on this stuff, and I had created a database and had my guys in the field. They would put in their data through a website. So all I did was pulled it into a spreadsheet from the data and then updated my pivot tables and charts. So it took me like 20 minutes for all the locations, and then we would have presentations. And learning how to navigate the upper management and the people in the field, to your point, is what got me where I'm at. And had I not had that experience, I wouldn't be good at this job, because there's a fine line between being too political and not wanting to offend somebody, if you will, and doing things right without offending people. So it is a challenge. You do make some people upset, and I just always stand behind, I didn't force you to do anything wrong. So I'm not going to take responsibility when I point it out.
Right.
Kind of the way and really it was that QC that taught me that.
So listening, to your experience with Coastal, I mean, it just sounds like the next logical step was to move into your role with NHLA. I'm assuming it wasn't quite that simple. So tell me about how that opportunity came about and how you kind of made that jump from Coastal to the NHLA.
It is a great story because throughout my time at Coastal, there was a couple different times where we had managers that would retire or just leave the company, and I would be their interim manager. So I would go in, and there was a location in northern Pennsylvania, not too far from Erie Lake, that snowed a lot, but I really liked the people over there. They had a great crew of people. It was a profitable mill. And so I was managing it for 5-6 months, but driving back to West Virginia every weekend. And I was offered the full-time position, and my wife's like, I'm not moving north. I don't like the snow now, and I definitely would like it up there. So I was like, well, she's just not going to, because that was not the first time, but it was one of the last times Coastal offered me an upgrade, if you will. So I was like, 2010, I believe it was, when they come on hard times. It was really a rough time in the market. So they ended up shutting down. And I had left there and went to work for another company for 3 or 4 months. And I just really didn't like the job. And finally that we parted ways. But during that time, I think you even had him on, or Phil Coiner, because I knew him from Coastal, where they were doing elims. We were using their handhelds.
Mm-hmm.
I got to give him a lot of credit. He taught me how to program some things and helped me through that. So I have to give him a lot of credit for that. And he had sent me an email where he got from NHLA, which is a little bit of a sore spot because I went to school here for 14 weeks. I never got anything from NHLA after I left here. He was a member, but he's getting these communications.
Right.
And so he sends me the ad that they had out for chief inspector. And I'm reading this email, and it's, located in Memphis, da-da-da. So I just deleted it. I'm like, nah, it ain't. My wife will never move. I get home, it was maybe a day or two later, on my wife, because she came here for management training to NHLA in 97, 98, somewhere around there. So she had laid out on the bar our magazine, Hardwood Matters, to that ad. And she said, why don't you apply for that job? And I said, well, you won't move to Memphis. And she said, you get the job, we'll move. I said, honey, you better start packing, because that's my job right there. And that's a true story. You could ask her. She'd tell you the same thing. Yeah. And again, like you said, I would not have been prepared for this had I not spent time at Coastal. I was too set in my ways, too rough with people. I mean, at one point in my career, I was supervising at Colonial for a while. I was called the White Rat. I didn't even know it, that's what they were, but I would like to catch people not working and chew them out right there. And I've just learned that's not good. So, but, and it was well deserved. There is one other thing that happened at Coastal that I would recommend to anyone, was Dale Carnegie training. They required all the managers to have that. I thought it was absurd when I was doing it. But after the fact, I was like, wow, that was a revelation too. And it helped me in my career there and here. And the other part of that is, on my resume, I had all my work experience and everything when I was interviewing for this job. And the president at the time, Dave Redmond, which I have a lot of respect for, I love that guy. He said the most impressive thing on your resume is the fact you took Dale Carnegie training. So I'm not saying it for an ad. It just really helped personal development and management development for me.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Phil. He was my boss. He's how I got into the industry. He hired me back in 2009 as an intern. So that's funny. I never knew that story.
Yeah. He was there trying to sell the handhelds, and I had already had a website built by another guy that worked for us, and he taught me a little bit, the other guy. And I'm there with just trying to work with an Access database, and Phil's like, why don't you use SQL Server? I'm like, because I'm not paying for that. He said, but there's a free version. And then he's like, and I was using it. It was an Adobe brand something for programming. He's like, why don't you just download Visual Studios? And I'm like, I'm not paying. He's like, there's a free version. So now today I do a lot of programming. I build apps for talent and things like that. And it's all built on free software that I got from Microsoft. And so, yeah, I owe him a lot, and I tell him that all the time, that he was how I got a lot more knowledgeable in the computer world. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, obviously you learned a lot of lessons along the way that I think sort of set you up for success at NHLA. Once you moved into that role, what were some of the early lessons or learning curves that you ran into?
Well, the one thing, and it's tough for a lot of managers to have remote employees, but also back to my Coastal days, I had 6 techs out in the field. So I would see them once or twice a year. That thing was kind of the same when I came here, which gave me that unique heads up. I mean, I was that much further ahead than a lot of people. A lot of people, are so used to micromanaging that they can't really allow their people to do their jobs. And I was blessed with some really good people out in the field as well. And so that was helpful. And one thing I learned was that we were really, I hate to use the word antiquated, but extremely antiquated would probably be more appropriate. We were, all my field guys had fax machines, and we were writing everything on paper. They had legitimate forms they filled out. We actually still have some, but they were like triplicate forms. When they did work, they would have to fax one in, give the company they worked at one. And so we had 2 or 3 people here just to do billing for the field guys. And at the time, there were 5 guys out in the field. And I'm like, are you serious? This is our method. And so then I created a similar thing like I had at Coastal, a website with a database where all the billing went through that. And then I took it even a step further and created it where the office personnel just had to click one button and it created an invoice on our side. So it transferred over their database. So, but the one thing that was really odd is I really wasn't given a list of responsibilities when I started. It was pretty much like it was with my QC tech days. Here's a job, figure it out, which some people would look at it as how am I supposed to do this? I was like, wow, this is a blank slate.
Right.
So I took what my predecessors had done to a whole different level. Now, that's great for me because I like to be busy all the time. I mean, I travel around the world a lot. Used to be 50% of my time, but still do all this stuff too. I think it'd be a challenge, and this is going to sound a bit arrogant. It's going to be tough to replace everything that I've done from a single person. And only because they wouldn't have the experience that I've had. So, but that being said, it has given me a lot of room to grow in different directions.
So that's an interesting segue. You mentioned, you touched on international travel, and the last time you and I chatted at IHLA, you said that was one of the sort of eye-opening experiences when you got into the industry and working with NHLA. So tell me a little bit more about some of those early experiences of, kind of getting a taste of international travel and how that was sort of an eye-opening experience for you.
Yeah, I think I told you this, a little bit of a story. I didn't have a passport till 2007, and it was because of a lumber claim that we had at one of our mills from Coastal in Mexico. So I rushed and got my passport so I could go to Mexico and resolve the issue. In the meantime, the sales manager and somebody else decided they would go and resolve it. So that first trip I was supposed to go on, and it didn't happen, but in a way it was a blessing in disguise because the guys went to the border and they made them come inside, and the parking lot they were in, they robbed their car. They stole their luggage, computers, everything. So they cleaned out the car. So, and in hindsight, I'm like, well, I'm glad I didn't go on that trip because I don't know that I'd ever want to travel.
Sure.
So when I did get to leave the country, first time in my life was in 2010, 2 weeks after I took this job, I was in Vancouver, Canada. So that first trip was like, I don't understand any of this because I hadn't even flown that much. So not only was I into the security lines, but then going through customs and all that was a big revelation or eye opener to me. But then the first time I left the continent was in February of 2011. So I hadn't traveled at all. And in February 2011, I flew to Shanghai, China. And, there was a guy that used to be a former chief inspector, Bob Savastina, was working for NHLA as a contractor in Shanghai. So he gave me all the information I needed to get to my hotel, how to get taxis and all that. So he gave me a real quick rundown. But I'd get my flight. I go over to China. I get into my room finally after what seemed like a week to get there. And literally I stand in front of the mirror and I say, what is a dumb West Virginian doing in China? And But it was just like, I'm a very picky eater. So, and my wife all the time gives me slack over this. Like, I don't like to eat broccoli. I don't like most green things once they're cooked. And I'm in China where you don't really know what you're eating. And I just jumped in and started eating. And I learned real quick, you eat whatever they give you. And if you don't like it, just stop eating it. And they'll bring you something else. So even though they understand the culture too, a lot of those people in China. So those are the kind of things that I learned really quick is getting around is not that complicated. I think that trip was the first time I'd ever even been inside a taxi cab.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, growing up in rural West Virginia, it's like we didn't have taxis. You either had a vehicle or you bummed a ride from somebody. So it was stacked on really fast and hard that first trip. And thinking back on it, it's probably the best thing could have happened. Otherwise, I'd have been thinking too much about it. So I didn't really even take time to think about it. I just did it. And then the thing was I went from Shanghai, China, after being there a week to New Delhi, India. And that was even more strange in many ways, but it was an odd experience. Just Shanghai, China, New Delhi, India, first time I ever off the continent. And the experience was going by so fast in my brain, I didn't have much time to absorb it. But, when you're traveling with people that have done it, it's second nature to them. And it really helped me to get through a lot of these, animosities, if you will. Like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to where, all right, you stand in this line, you get your passport stamped, you stand in this line. So after a while, it just became commonplace. But those first couple trips were really something else.
It sounds like it was the real life version of the old saying, from the frying pan into the fire, right?
Yeah. That's I don't want to say too much bad about anywhere I've been, but the place that, and actually I've gotten used to going to India. I've been there 7-8 times now, and it's more normal to me now. But just some of the smells and things like that is just off the hook. And it's like, wow, it's different. Let's put it that way.
I can imagine. So the next thing I kind of want to shift into is talking about, you mentioned you wear a lot of different hats in your role with NHLA. One of the most, I think, visible ones is obviously the grading rules and kind of maintaining that. So you guys update or you review proposed changes every 4 years submitted by NHLA members. So tell me a little bit more about that process, what that review is like, and do you have any interesting stories, or do you find that you have certain regions or groups of people that are really active in submitting rule change requests, or is it just kind of vary from year to year?
It a lot of it depends on what is submitted. So I've been through 13, I think 3 complete rules changes since I've been here, because it's every 4 years, like you said. There was one happening right when I started. So I basically was just kind of given, this is what's happened, the vote. But yeah, so the way it works is, to start with, we just start sending out notices. Rules committee is going to meet in a certain, it's usually in April, May. And we want rules submitted from the membership. So any member can submit a rules change. Only certain members are allowed to vote on that. So they get submitted, and I'm the first line that comes to. And my role is, if there's multiple suggestions of a similar rule or the same rule. So one guy might say it in one way or person, and the other person might put it in a different layout, but they mean the same. So then I get back with both parties, or 3 sometimes. Hey, do you guys want to agree on one? So you submit one. And so that can be a bit challenging, because some people are very strong on their wording and other things. So that happens. And then I submit a list of those to what we call the Rules Committee, which meets every 4 years, to your point. Could meet more often if needed, but their primary role is to meet every 4 years, and it pretty much stays the same people.
Yeah.
And it does help because they understand what happened previously, what happens in the future. And there'll be a few new ones on there, which brings in, some different perspective. It is, in all the meetings I've ever been in, it is the most productive, well-run meeting. And we go over a lot of information in about 4 hours, and we make decisions. It's final decisions immediately. I mean, we go through it fast. Now, most rules changes are subtle, like miscut rule we changed a few years ago, a little bit controversial, but it actually simplified the rule. So those kind usually go over fairly well. When you start talking about walnut rules, because it's the highest valued domestic species that's commercially available, it becomes a challenge. And some people would even refer to, and I've heard this term, I wouldn't use it, but the walnut mafia doesn't want it to change. And I have standing orders from some people that they want to know immediately when somebody submits a walnut rules change, which they're typically guys on that rules committee, so they are privy to that. Now, we do, once all the rules committee members get a copy of these, we do put it out for the industry to look at. Because we don't want to keep anything from our industry, but we got to make sure we don't send out 4 versions of the same rule either. So, but it typically, when they do submit rules changes, they're valid, good reasons. But usually it has to be something that affects a lot of people. We did have a rules change for aspen, which a lot of our industry doesn't even know that's a hardwood because doesn't grow in their area.
Right.
But it happened to be a student that was in class that was their primary product, making moldings out of aspen. And he said they had every purchase order place on that order that stain was not admitted. And in our rules previously, stain was admitted in all grades of aspen. So one company submitted it, and then what happens once it gets put out there from a rules committee, they call me, and they're wanting to know who, not necessarily who submitted it, but what was the reason behind it. And I'm not saying that I sway any votes, but I explained to them what the purpose was. And in that case, it went right through because they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. If they can't use stain, then why are we allowing stain? Because that's really how that kind of developed. And like I say, they don't change much, and that's a good thing because retraining, like the cutting sizes and all, that would be very. I don't use a lot of big words, so I'm just going to keep it simple. It would be very confusing for the current lumber inspectors to change some of the fundamentals,
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting that's going on in the industry right now, there's obviously a lot of emerging technologies, and there's new companies, both new and existing companies that are coming out. And the big push, I think, is sort of the golden apple that everyone's chasing is being able to do automated grading, right? So, I'm sure that comes up in discussion a lot and probably has for a number of years. So, how do you see that shaping the industry and, both your role as well as, I guess I see it as having a lot of impacts in grading rules in how you train people, like what the inspector training school will look like in 5 or 10 years. I would imagine there's kind of a lot of things that could potentially change.
That's a great point. And it is, we do have a lot of discussions about that at our board level. But to start out with, I'd like to say I'm a big fan of the computerized grading. And I say that because grading is a physical job that these guys have to endure, whether they're standing at the end of the pile, even if they're sitting in a chair and watching the boards flip, it's still a physical type job. And it can become monotonous, not that it does for a lot of people, but because it's almost like assembly line work, if you will, and you'll start daydreaming, things like that, which I've witnessed all these things in my career. and it's hard to stay excited. Sometimes, like if it's all clear boards, you're like, why am I even sitting here? So there's things like that these computers will be able to handle simply. I mean, I've worked with cameras for years as like a hobby, and I was doing this recognition thicknesses and all these measures through a camera in 2005. So, because I was doing real-time thickness measurements with a camera. And so I do understand the technology. I don't understand AI. That's a little above my, I haven't learned much about that yet. I have seen some of these grading machines and they do work well. Couple of things. One, I like to let the people manufacturing these machines to know that if it says FAS, it needs to meet our minimum requirements. Unless there's something in writing for that company saying it's different, and then they'd have to change the name. So because FAS, and it's a published standard, they could be liable, is the point I'm getting to. So if they let an owner of the company make decisions in there for the standard grades, they could end up being liable at some point. Now, I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm just saying, make sure that you set the machine up to do standard grades. And if they want to have a proprietary grades, let them call it something different, like Prime or ComCell or something that's not a trademark name. That's one thing. And you mentioned our school, how it's going to change. I think it's going to change the level of education we have to give here. I think we're going to have to train at a higher level and more of a quality control. Because as you know, you've been around computers and things. When a computer does something wrong, it will repeat that wrong every time until somebody fixes it. And I'm a little bit afraid of our industry saying, set it and forget it like a Ronco dehydrator. It's not going to be that easy. And the only way you're going to know is to monitor. So I think the future for our industry and our school is more for quality control for hardwoods. And that goes right back to my roots. And we do that now through the national inspectors out in the field. We do a lot more QC than we ever have in the past at a much higher level. I mean, I've built a program that any of our industry can use. I can just create them a login and they can use that. They can get the reports generated. I mean, all of their data gets entered on a phone. So they don't even have to buy special equipment. They get the phone and the app goes on it and it synchronizes and everything. But in my opinion, that's where we have to get to in order to not only for NHLA's purpose, but to help our industry advance into the future, because more things are going to have to be automated and optimized, if you will.
You know, it's interesting, your analogy of the set it and forget it. You know, I think that sort of sounds like it's a good thing in some ways, because obviously when most people hear AI and automation, that, the fear is it's going to take my job, right? And I think the reality is it's not going to take people's jobs as much as it's going to change their job. So you're still going to have someone that is the grader, that the human that's in charge, right? That's controlling it, that's inspecting it, that's monitoring the grade out. But I think in the long term, it's going to give people the ability to do more with the same staff they already have.
Yeah, and I have read that more than once, where companies will put in, let's say, a bin sorter that sorts the lumber out. And I'm like, did that save you any employees? And they said, no, it didn't save employees, which is what they were going after. What it did do was give them the ability to increase production with the same number of people. So in a sense, it did lower their costs because they were able to produce more lumber. The same thing with these automated graders. They'll be able to handle a board every second or a half second in some cases, to where a human just can't do it. And we have steadily increased production in a lot of places to the point where an inspector cannot be accurate. They don't have time to turn the board over. So that's why I'm a big fan of this computerized grading, as long as somebody's monitoring it. And I have a saying and actually I'm going to have a presentation here in a couple of months about it, is automation versus optimization. And automation is the Ronco dehydrator. Automate. Yeah, you can automate it so you take that manual labor off of somebody. But to be optimized, you have to monitor it, make sure it's set up right, and continually monitor that machine to make sure it's producing what you want at an optimum level. And I don't know that people really understand it. When they're sold a machine that's like an optimized edger is a great example. There's very few that I have seen that are actually optimized. They're automated, and that's great. But if you got to pay for that machine, you need to make sure it's set up right and operating all times at optimum level.
So, with that in mind, do you see the NHLA playing a role down the line of, certification? So if you're a company that's producing these automated board graders, do you see there being a possibility of, okay, this is an NHLA certified board grader, and having sort of the standards that they have to meet, or, a grade out percentage that they have to meet before they can become, officially certified?
Well, that is that's part of the discussion we're having, and we've had since the 70s a facility grade certification. So anybody that would put in a machine that's in that program, we will check the lumber from the machine and their inspectors, so that we're saying that all of them are meeting the minimum specifications. The problem I have with our program for that purpose, I don't think it's strict enough. So in other words, a human will self-adjust. So if they know they're being too tough on it, they might loosen up, or vice versa. If they're misjudging stain, next time they might be tougher or looser on it. Where a machine, you set it, it's going to continue to do that way. I know the AI, and I understand it a little bit, how it learns, but it only learns from what a human taught it. So if the human teaching it is not at a high level, your machine's not going to be at a high level. And that's why I say the monitoring of this equipment in an accurate way. So I do believe NHLA has a big role in that. How we go about it in an economical way, so both parties are winning in that situation, that's the challenge. Because truly, I think it should be checked every week. I don't have enough staff to check these things every week. So with our quality control program we're doing now, we're teaching the people on site how to utilize them, how to measure things, and then we monitor the QC tech, which was more like my role back in coastal days. So we taught local guys how to do the work, and then we wanted to make sure they were staying with the parameters of accuracy. And, getting through that hurdle, and I think it'll be easier with a machine than it is with a human to monitor, because if you're monitoring another human, you're like, well, I know he had a bad day. But, if you're QC, it doesn't matter. You just need to record what was actually happening, so that then you can make a better decision. So some of those things will be a big hurdle for some people to get through. But with a machine, I think if you explain to people they don't have feelings, they don't go out and party on the weekends, so there's no excuse for that machine other than something's broken. So I think those kind of things that's the direction that we're trying to go, or at least that's where I want to go with it, because I know we need to. I could give you story after story about wasted money from people with the optimization equipment.
So that's actually a really interesting segue. I think that kind of takes me into the second hat that you guys wear, and something that I'm really interested in learning more about is, the other value add services that you guys provide. Most interestingly to me is your yield analysis. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So when I was with Coastal, after we had established, we had 15 different tests we did, depending on the mill and if they had dry kilns or not. But we had 15 different tests we did. And at some point, my boss at the time, Steve Wagner, he's retired, he wanted to give the forestry department and the log buyers prices of what our break-even value of a log was. So and I built a database just for that website where they can put it in. And each mill was required to do 25 logs of different species and different log diameter class and grades. So they would be 25 logs each time of a very similar size and grade. And we'd run those through, and we would time how long it took to process the log so we could look at the costs while we did it. And using their P&Ls that I got every month, we were able to tell them to a penny how much that log was worth. So that having that break-even log value, then you knew how much you could have in the log before it went through the mill. And then, you get varying differences, different mills, different setups, different regions with different log qualities and things like that. But we were able to do it over time, and we had this huge database that we knew exactly which logs to put through the mill to make a profit, which ones to sell.
Mm-hmm.
So that all started about 2005, 6, somewhere around there. So when I came here, for years, I was, dealing with other things, hadn't even started in the quality control yet here. And I kept hearing people saying, well, they're buying these logs over in China and I can't compete with them. So it got me to thinking, why are we selling our raw material? I couldn't figure out how, because I went to China, I saw processed logs, and I'm like, they're not doing anything really different. We are. In a few cases they were, but in most cases they were sawing similar to what we do. So then it's like, is their labor cheaper or not? They had as many people pulling stuff as we do on a typical mill. So I'm like, there's got to be something different. And then it dawned on me, I don't know that people understand what the value of their logs are. Maybe they're selling them at a loss and don't realize it. So that's when I got a team of guys together. I brought a guy that used to be the CEO of Anderson Tully, which they had done a huge study. Myself, and then another one of my national guys, Mark Baer, that worked for Anderson Tully back then and knew about the study and how they did it. So we got together and we said, okay, let's see what we can do for our industry. And that started about, I want to say 2016. And we started out one way, and then I created the database to collect the data and just went from there with it. Early on, we made some mistakes in the ways we were doing things, but we've stuck to our guns on log grades. We use Forest Service log grades, which has been out since the 40s. We do the diameter classes, which is also with the Forest Service. So we started doing that, and we started realizing there was a lot of patterns in there within species. So white oak tends to do the same thing, white oak across the board, red oak, same thing. And then we're able to help people in a lot of ways because when we're there, we do quality control things too, like measure thicknesses and opening phase. We're checking the graders on some occasions. So we find a lot of areas. And then we decided to take it another level, and on the front of that report, which gets generated as soon as we're done, we can generate the report, and it has basically the front sheet is low-hanging fruit. So we look at how much downtime do you have, how many employees do you have, looking at how much common and better you got out of that batch. What's your lumber tally versus what we found? What's their log scale tally? So it's basically a low-hanging fruit sheet on the front. And a lot of times that's in millions of dollars. And we like to explain to them, is it possible to get all this? Yes. Is it practical? In a lot of cases, no, because you may have to put different equipment in. We do not encourage people to change equipment. We help them to maximize what they have. If they want to ask about the equipment, we will tell them there's stuff available to do this, this, and this. But we didn't start into this to sell equipment. We started in this to help people to realize what's the value of the logs and where can I make improvements to buy more logs. Because we want our mills to produce the lumber, not China. So, not only China. I don't mean to pick on China. Any country. India buys a lot of logs, and other countries. So it's like, why not create the lumber here It's better for freight and a lot of different things if we ship it out lumber. So within that, it didn't take long for us to start finding these optimized edgers weren't optimized. And areas of weakness in the mills was astounding to me. I mean, we did one of the early days the company was losing, we estimated $500,000 just at their edger.
Oh,
and
wow.
It turns out it was closer to $1 million once they fixed it. So one of the mistakes I made was I should have said, I want a percentage of the improvements and rather than just charge a flat fee. But that's a joke. But anyway, I think we've really helped a lot of people, and we've had a lot of companies have us come back, do other species. They'll add equipment, have us come back and see if they actually gained what they thought they would. We've had a company did a yield analysis, and they completely put a whole new sawmill. It didn't produce what they wanted, but it turns out the parameters weren't set right in their mill, so we helped them to get that set up right. So to say that we are experts in sawmills, no, but we are experts in measuring the output. So if people think about that, the improvements is on the mill to do, but we can point out where there's possible areas of improvement. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. Again, it's back to my QC days. I don't want to tell you what you're doing wrong. I'll show you all these things you're doing right and some areas that you may want to look at.
Yeah, it sounds like, I was reading through some of the testimonials on the NHLA site for the yield analysis. And, the common theme in reading through a lot of those is, I think a lot of these companies understand that there's a value to this, but they don't understand just how much value until they really go through it. It seems like a lot of people kind of say, we thought this would be a good idea. And then once we saw the data and we saw what we could do to improve, it made a huge impact. Do you sort of see this as something that would benefit every NHLA member company? I mean, is it something is there anybody that wouldn't benefit from doing this?
You bring up a great point. One thing we haven't done yet is for some of our members don't do the sawmill. They have dry kilns. We can do a similar thing there as well. We haven't done any yet, but I do have experience in that side. But to your point, we've had companies that we went and measured everything, and the improvements was less than $10,000. And they were extremely happy. And I'm like, well, to me, it seems like you wasted money. And they're like, no. I wanted to know if we were doing everything right. So they were probably happier than the guys that found that there was issues. And then thinking back on it, I'm like, well, that does make sense. And actually, we've done multiples at a couple of places. When they make a change, they might want to test. The thing is, they can do these on their own, and we do encourage them to do these type things. But they may not have the expertise. They most likely don't have the analytical part as well, because my experience is what got me to that.
Right.
And, there's a lot of other factors go into that. And plus, they just don't want to take the time to do it. And they're happier to pay us to come in. We don't usually mess much with their production at all. Our tests don't take that long, maybe a half a day of production, although we're there 2 days, but we only slow them down for half a day most of the time. So those kind of things are low impact to them. And that's why we do a smaller test. And that we'd like to do multiple tests on other species. So it's a low impact on their company.
Sure.
You're right. I mean, if most of the people we go and help them, the payback's less than 2 weeks. So it's like, you can't afford to do, something that's going to cost you 2 weeks. One of the areas that we have been looking at is with the automation and optimization equipment out there. I'd like to see more equipment manufacturers, having us go in and do a yield analysis before and then after, so that they have, here's the proof that our equipment increased. Because right now they're using estimations or guesstimations, as I like to use.
Sure.
It'll increase your yield by 20%. And in reality, it was only 10. Well, why not have, here's proof that our machine increased at 20% or 15. I think it would also help with the fine tuning of the equipment. And I'm not saying we go do yield analysis They put the equipment in and go right back and do it. It takes time to get equipment running. It's just, once they're settled, it's working, then we come and test. And then you have a comparison. It'd be well worth their money, I think.
Yeah, I would. That's something I wouldn't have thought about, but it makes a lot of sense that that's value. I mean, you said you run into things where they have an optimized edger that's not really all that optimized. So it seems like it's a value to the manufacturers to help like fine tune their staff, their installers, right?
Yeah, and they could probably tack that onto the price, which is still not that expensive. We don't charge that much to do these. Well, in comparison, the Anderson Tully test I talked about earlier, I think it was $300,000.
Oh, wow.
The most we've ever charged anybody was $12,000. So now it's different in a lot of different scope and things like that. But in reality, that was the same information they got. So it's like, maybe we're too cheap. I don't know.
It's like you can't afford not to do it, right? I mean, that's one of the things that stood out to me from those from the testimonials. I think it was Mike Powers from Mailing Works and Kirkham when he said, worst case scenario, we'll confirm that we're doing everything perfect. Like
that. Yeah, that's a good point. And like I say, I wouldn't think of that, but everybody likes to know where they stand. I haven't gotten there yet, but I will be able to share with everybody like the industry average. I just haven't got the reports built yet because all this takes time and I got a full-time job on top of that.
Right.
But that would be part of it, like benchmarking, if you will. So if all the sawmills in the study average this, then people like to know where they stand above and below. Without sharing anybody's information, I could do that and say, well, here's what the industry average is.
Yeah. Yeah,
so
that'd be super useful.
Yeah, anybody that's done a study would have access to see where they stand against other people, other averages. So.
I can just imagine the competitions and the conversations at the at the next NHLA show. And like, hey, we're in third place, we're in second place.
That's right. Well, that is interesting you bring it up because that was part of my division meetings that we would have. We would always have bar graphs for every test. And the best ones are always on the left and the worst ones are on the right. And I can remember the vice president saying before every meeting, you better hope you're not on the right. And everybody's always on the right side.
Right.
And that was just, everybody was scared when their charts came up. And it was usually the one that didn't seem to care much about when I was doing the testing until that day. And then all of a sudden their eyes were open.
So I think the next thing I want to jump into is, it's sort of the third big piece of what you do with NHLA. And I think it will sort of bookend our conversation as well is, your involvement with the inspector training school. Obviously, that's one of the ways you got your start in the industry. What is it like and what does it mean to you to be able to help train the next generation? And sort of impart a lot of the wisdom and the lessons that you've learned along the way.
Well, that's a great question. The first, when I first started here, I was, I don't know if it's kind of weird. It's like going back to visiting your high school, a bit intimidated because, my last experience here was taking a test and it was like, oh my goodness, I finally passed. But coming into the class, one thing I have to do is make sure I don't waste the students' time, if you will,
right.
Because I've got to think back to what it was like for me. I like to tell stories and I can give them a lot of experience. And unfortunately, I can also throw in shortcuts that they don't need to know yet. So I have to be very cautious of that. But being able to share stories to explain rules, I've gotten a lot better at that. So even Roman Matashenko, our instructor, he'll come over and say, hey, we have a board over here we'd like for you to look at. And I love it when he does it because not only will I say, because I rarely would ever go and say, that's a knot. I'm going to tell him a story about the time that this was a problem so that it sticks with him. And it's given me, again, a very unique opportunity to share experiences that way. I really hope a lot of people learn from that as well. But I know myself, I'll learn more if you can tie a story to it. Because I typically remember that story more than the lesson. And then you come to the lesson through the story. So
right.
the one thing that we have been able to do is decrease the amount of time through the education without losing the quality of education. But the other thing is increasing the opportunities, like the different classes that we're doing and stuff now. So it's been interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, it's sort of a reflection. This is the Roots and Reflections podcast. You've had a lot of experiences in your career, and obviously you've gotten to spend a lot of time with, the next generation that are coming up. What is one, or I guess some of the key bits of advice that you would give to the next generation of young men and women that are coming into the industry, and sort of how to succeed and how to thrive?
Well, that's another good question. I've started a couple years ago, for every class now, I talk about leadership. And within that leadership, I talk about how I got where I'm at. And I tell them that you can be whatever you want to be. Everything's within limitations. But if you don't work towards something, you're never going to get there. So it's like basically saying, I got to go to the store, but you never get to leave the house. So you've always got to be working towards something. But I also tell them, you're always going to be answering to somebody. So even if you're the top boss, a good example of that is Nick Saban. Everybody probably knows Nick Saban. He will tell you, his wife tells him what to do. It don't matter what you do. So if you just come to that realization, you're always going to be working for somebody, but always work to help that person. And not only, help above you, help behind you. So being a good leader, it doesn't mean you're a boss or a manager or anything. Helping other people is what makes you a leader. So, you're right along with them, dragging that rope and dragging that sled. And I try to leave them with that when they graduate. Say, just keep working to better yourself and others, and you will be somewhere someday, irregardless of your circumstance and all these other things that people. A good friend of mine one time told me the simplest way was stop being a victim. And if you have the victim mentality, you will be a victim. So stop treating yourself as a victim and move forward. And you can be a leader in anything you do, and you can learn. And I tell people all the time, I didn't grow up with computers. I can program computers. I've never had any formal training. I've just decided I was going to do it. And here I am. I'm programming apps and things like that. So you shouldn't limit yourself. And if the other wise thing was told to me many years ago, and everybody's heard it, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And that's where I'm at in my career. I just love what I do. Now, I have bad days. I have great days.
Right.
But I love what I do. So I don't feel like I even have a job. I'm just happy I get paid for doing something I love to do.
I feel the same way. So, the core of this podcast is, we like to find interesting people with interesting stories, or maybe it's an interesting company with an interesting story in the hardwood industry. So one thing I always like to ask people is, who do you think we should talk to next?
Boy, I've met a lot of interesting people out there. And I'm just trying to think of somebody I think you should talk to would be Jeff Workline. I would to hear his story, because I've heard a few times and how he started basically with nothing and where he's at today. So he'd be a good one to do. I could give you a long list, so if you ever need recommendations, but just off the top of my mind, I think he'd be a good one to talk about, because he's on the distribution side, which is something a lot of our folks on the East Coast probably aren't too much aware of how that works.
Right.
Him being in Portland and how they're taking our products from this end over to the West Coast, and they love them over there. So the people need to understand that, I think. So I think he'd be good.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to add him to the list. And it sounds like we might just have to have you send us your laundry list. It'll just keep us busy for the next couple of years.
Oh, yeah. So really, if you do run into a challenge of needing people, I try to recommend people that I believe other people would be interested in hearing their story and their background and things. So, yeah, I'd be happy to.
Well, I think that's a good point and a good opportunity to wrap it up. I want to thank you again for taking this time to chat with us. I think you have a really interesting story, and I learned a lot just in this conversation, more so than I knew from the 10 plus years of knowing you. So I appreciate it, and have a great day.
Now, Ben, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'd actually told somebody one day I'd love to write a book, but the reality hits me that I'm not a writer. So, but I just think there's so much that I've not even told most people close to me, that just because so much stuff happens, I'll just recall it at some weird point, like in the middle of the night, I'll go, oh crap, that was fun. Or, wow, I can't believe that happens. But the one thing that probably from my international travels that I have learned is that no matter where you're at and no matter what people you run into around the world, there's good people everywhere. And I didn't know that until, because if you ever saw the news, you'd think, oh my goodness, what's wrong with these people? The people around the world want the same things I do. They want to be successful. They want to have a family. They want to live a good life. And the only thing that's wrong around the world is the governments. And truly, in the end, that's the difference. Is we all have the same government type problems, and we all want to be successful and be happy. And there's good people everywhere. So it's changed my perspective, to be honest.